There are truths that people hear repeatedly yet never fully step into. Truths that are familiar in language but distant in experience. And the difference between hearing and understanding is not small. It is the difference between limitation and freedom, between struggle and victory, between carrying burdens and walking in authority. Because truth, when left at the surface, remains inactive. But truth, when deeply understood, begins to transform everything it touches. As April moves closer to its end, there is a growing urgency in the atmosphere, not one of fear, but of realization, a realization that time has been moving, opportunities have been present, and yet something deeper is calling for attention. It is not a call to do more, strive harder, or push beyond limits through effort alone. It is a call to understand something that has already been done, something that has already been finished. Many continue to move forward, carrying invisible weight, not because they are weak, not because they lack discipline, but because they have not fully grasped what has already been secured on their behalf. They keep trying to break through doors that have already been opened. They keep resisting battles that have already been won. They keep questioning outcomes that have already been decided. And this creates a cycle where effort replaces understanding, where struggle replaces authority, where striving replaces alignment. It feels like progress is being made, yet something remains unresolved beneath the surface. Something continues to resist, to delay, to create pressure without clear explanation. This is where the difference between knowledge and revelation becomes clear. Knowledge says something is true. Revelation makes it real. Knowledge hears about victory. Revelation lives in it. There is a truth that has been spoken for generations, repeated in countless moments, acknowledged in countless ways, but still not fully activated in many lives. The truth about the blood of Jesus, not as a distant idea, not as a symbolic statement, but as a present, active force that carries authority, that establishes identity, and that secures outcomes beyond human effort. A truth that does not depend on feelings to remain valid. A truth that does not weaken over time. A truth that does not require reinforcement to stay true, but does require understanding to be experienced. Because what is not understood cannot be fully applied, and what is not applied cannot produce results. There are battles that seem persistent, not because they are powerful, but because the truth that defeats them has not been fully enforced. There are struggles that appear complex, not because they are unbreakable, but because the authority that ends them has not been fully recognized. This is why the moment before April ends is significant. It is not about the date itself, it is about the opportunity it represents. A closing window that invites a shift from surface level belief into deep, unshakable understanding. A moment that demands a decision to continue operating from partial awareness or to step fully into revealed truth, because time does not slow down for understanding to catch up. And what is delayed in understanding often becomes prolonged in experience. There is no benefit in knowing something powerful if it remains unused. There is no advantage in having access to authority if it is never exercised, and there is no transformation in truth that is acknowledged but not activated. The blood was not shed as a concept. It was released with purpose. It carried intention. It secured something that could not be achieved through human effort alone. It secured victory. Not temporary victory, not conditional victory, but complete, finished, and irreversible victory. A victory that does not depend on circumstances aligning perfectly. A victory that does not fluctuate with emotions or external situations. A victory that remains constant, whether it is recognized or not. Whether it is recognized or not. But here is where the shift must happen. Victory that is not recognized often goes unclaimed. Victory that is not understood often goes unenforced. And what is unenforced can appear absent, even when it is fully present. This is why understanding the truth about the blood is not optional. It is essential, because once it is fully grasped, something changes internally. The mindset shifts, the perception adjusts, the need to struggle begins to fade, the constant pressure to make things happen there begins to lose its hold, and in its place comes a quiet but unshakable confidence, one that is not based on circumstances but on something already settled. Before April ends, this shift must take place, not gradually, not eventually, but intentionally, to move beyond repeating what has been heard and step into fully understanding what has been given, to stop approaching life from a position of trying to win and begin operating from a position of already having won. Because everything changes when victory is no longer pursued but enforced. And what is understood in this moment will determine what is experienced in the days that follow. There are voices that shape reality more than circumstances ever could. Voices that influence decisions, define identity, and determine direction long before any external result appears. Some of these voices are obvious, spoken words, visible opinions, clear statements. But others are subtle, operating beneath the surface, repeating quietly until they begin to feel like truth. These are the voices of accusation, of doubt, of limitation. They do not always come loudly. Often they come as thoughts. Suggestions that question worth, that remind of past failures, that highlight present struggles, and attempt to predict a future that looks no different from the past. Over time, when left unchallenged, these voices begin to establish authority. They begin to define what is believed, and what is believed begin to shape what is experienced. What is experienced. This is how unseen influence becomes lived reality. Because what is heard consistently is eventually accepted. And what is accepted is eventually lived. But there is another voice, one that does not argue for attention, yet carries more authority than all others combined. A voice that does not repeat itself out of weakness, but speaks once with finality. A voice that does not depend on agreement to all remain true. The voice of the blood of Jesus. This voice does not operate like human voices. It does not debate. It does not negotiate. And it does not adjust based on circumstances. It speaks from a finished position. It declares what has already been established, what has already been secured, and what cannot be undone. And what it speaks stands. The blood speaks on behalf of redemption. It speaks on behalf of victory. It speaks on behalf of identity that is no longer tied to failure, no longer defined by past mistakes, and no longer limited by previous conditions. It declares a reality that overrides every opposing voice. Where accusation speaks of guilt, the blood speaks of forgiveness. Where doubt speaks of uncertainty, the blood speaks of completion. Where limitation speaks of boundaries, the blood speaks of freedom. And unlike other voices, it does not weaken over time. It does not need to be repeated to stay valid. It does not require reinforcement to remain true. It has already spoken, and what it has spoken remains active. This is what makes it different. because most voices gain power through repetition. But the voice of the blood carries power through completion. It does not speak to create possibility. It speaks to confirm reality, a reality that has already been settled. Yet many continue to live as though that voice is silent, not because it has stopped speaking, but because it has not been fully recognized. Because attention has been given to other voices, louder voices, more familiar voices, more persistent voices that seem more connected to present experience. And what receives attention often feels more real. This is where the shift must happen, because truth does not become reality when it is spoken. It becomes reality when it is believed and aligned with. And alignment requires awareness. It requires a conscious decision to recognize where a voice holds authority and which ones do not. Before April ends, this recognition becomes critical, because every day that passes without alignment is another day where lesser voices attempt to take control. Another day where accusation tries to redefine identity. Another day where doubt tries to weaken confidence. Another day where limitation tries to present itself as truth. But none of these voices have final authority. They only have influence where they are allowed. And influence loses power the moment a higher authority is recognized. This is why the blood does not need to argue. It only needs to be acknowledged. Because once it is acknowledged, everything else is repositioned. Accusation loses its voice. Doubt loses its strength. Limitation loses its hold. Not gradually, but immediately, because the authority of the blood does not operate on delay. It is already established. But recognition activates experience. This is the difference between knowing that something is true and living as though it is true. Between hearing about authority and actually walking in it. Between being aware of victory and fully enforcing it. Before April ends, there must be a decision to shift attention, to stop allowing lesser voices to define what is possible, and to start aligning with the voice that has already declared what is finished, because what is listened to shapes what is believed, and what is believed shapes what is lived. The voice of the blood is not distant. It is not inactive. It is not waiting. It is already speaking. The only question is whether it will be recognized as the final authority. There is a point where every limitation must be questioned, not from a place of doubt, but from a place of truth. Because not every boundary that appears real actually has authority. Not every restriction that feels permanent was designed to remain. And not every label that has been carried still holds the right to define identity. Redemption changes all of that. It is not an adjustment. It is not a gradual improvement. It is a complete exchange, one that removes what once was and replaces it with something entirely new. It does not repair the old. It establishes the new. And in doing so, it brings an end to every limitation that was once considered normal. The blood of Jesus is the foundation of that redemption. It did not create partial access to freedom. It secured full release. It did not open a possibility for change. It finalized it. It did not begin a process waiting to be completed. It completed what was necessary so that a new position could be fully occupied. This is where many misunderstand. Because limitations often feel real due to repetition. They feel permanent because they have been experienced consistently. They feel valid because they have shaped decisions, influenced direction, and created patterns that seem difficult to break. But repetition does not equal authority. Just because something has been experienced many times does not mean it still has the right to continue. Redemption interrupts that assumption. It declares that what once defined boundaries no longer has legal standing, that what once restricted movement no longer has permission to remain, that what once shaped identity no longer has authority to speak. This includes every form of limitation. Limitations created by past mistakes. Limitations reinforced by repeated failure. Limitations built through fear, doubt, or external pressure. All of these lose their foundation in the presence of redemption. Because redemption does not negotiate with the past, it removes its authority. It does not slowly weaken limitations, it cancels them. It does not leave room for old definitions to coexist with new identity. It replaces them completely. This is why redemption must be understood, not just acknowledged. Because without understanding, it is possible to be free and still live as though bound. To be released and still think in terms of restriction. To have access to victory and still operate from limitation. This is not because redemption failed, but because it was not fully accepted. Acceptance is what activates freedom. It is the moment where internal agreement aligns with established truth, where the mind releases old definitions and embraces new reality, where identity is no longer built on past experience, but on present truth. And once that shift happens, everything begins to change. The way decisions are made changes. The way challenges are approached changes. The way identity is perceived changes. Because limitation is no longer the reference point. Before April ends, this truth must be settled clearly. Limitation is no longer valid, not partially invalid, not conditionally removed, completely cancelled. Complainter. There is no remaining authority in what has already been redeemed, no power left in what has already been broken, no influence left in what has already been removed, unless it is allowed to return through misunderstanding. And this is where awareness becomes critical, because old patterns often attempt to return, not with authority, but with familiarity. They appear the same, feel the same, and try to re-establish themselves as though nothing has changed. But something has changed. Authority has shifted. And what once had power now only has memory. This is why reinforcement is necessary. Not to make redemption real, but to remind the mind that it already is. To ensure that old limitations are not unconsciously re-accepted. To maintain alignment with what has already been secured. Because what is not reinforced internally can be replaced by what is familiar externally. Before April ends, the 2nd, there must be a clear decision to reject every limitation that no longer has authority, to stop negotiating with old patterns, to stop identifying with past definitions, to stop allowing previous experiences to dictate present reality. Because redemption has already spoken, and what it has declared is final. Freedom is not had, it is now. Release is not coming, it is already established. Victory is not uncertain, it is secured. The only remaining step is alignment. To think from it, to speak from it, to live from it. Because once redemption is fully accepted, limitation has nowhere left to remain. There are moments when protection is not just desired, it is necessary. Not because fear is present, but because awareness has increased. Awareness that not every challenge is visible. Awareness that not every form of resistance announces itself before it acts. Awareness that some pressures arrive quietly, some disruptions begin subtly, and some influences attempt to operate without ever being recognized. This is where true protection becomes essential. Not surface level safety, not temporary shielding, but a covering that is constant, enforced, and unbreakable. A boundary that does not depend on human strength to remain intact. A protection that operates whether it is seen or not. The blood of Jesus establishes that level of protection. It does not act as a symbolic covering. It functions as an active barrier, a line that cannot be casually crossed, a boundary that does not negotiate with opposition, a force that denies access to anything that does not align with victory. This is not fragile protection that weakens under pressure. It is enforced protection that remains steady regardless of circumstances. Because what has been established through the blood is not subject to change. There are forces that attempt to influence outcomes silently, pressures that build without clear origin, deceptions that seem to appear without explanation. These are not always physical. They often operate in ways that cannot be traced easily, yet their effects are real. Unexplained heaviness, sudden confusion, persistent resistance without visible cause. These are often signs of influence attempting to gain or maintain access. But influence requires permission, either through awareness or lack of resistance. And this is where the blood changes everything. Because where the blood is applied with understanding, permission is revoked. Access is denied. Not partially, not temporarily, completely. This means no intrusion without confrontation, no influence without challenge, no disruption without being addressed. It establishes a perimeter where anything that attempts to operate outside of alignment is immediately restricted. It shuts down silent entry points. It blocks unseen pathways. It removes hidden influences. And it does so without needing visible confirmation. This is what makes this covering different. It does not wait for danger to appear before acting. It remains active at all times. It anticipates, blocks, and prevents before impact occurs. It does not react, it enforces. But like every truth, it must be understood to be experienced. Because protection that is not recognized is often not applied. And what is not applied leaves room for unnecessary vulnerability. Not because protection is absent, but because it has not been consciously activated. Activation is not about creating power. It is about aligning with what already exists. It is the decision to acknowledge the covering, to declare it, and to stand in it without hesitation. Before April ends, this becomes critical because awareness without activation leaves gaps, and gaps, even small ones, can become access points if left unchecked, not because the protection is weak, but because alignment has not been fully established. This is why consistency matters. Not occasional acknowledgement, but daily reinforcement. Not passive belief, but active declaration. Not uncertain hope, but confident authority. Because what is consistently enforced remains consistently effective. There must be a shift from hoping for protection to operating within it. From reacting to situations to maintaining a position where unauthorized influence cannot easily enter. This is not about fear of what could happen. It is about control over what will not be allowed to happen. And that control has already been given. The blood does not fail under pressure. It does not weaken over time. It does not require external validation to remain effective. It stands. The only question is whether it is being stood in. Before April ends, there must be a conscious decision to fully step into this covering, to stop leaving space for what does not belong, to close every possible entry point that has been left unguarded through unawareness. Because once alignment is established, protection becomes natural, not something to chase, not something to question, but something to live within. And what is lived within cannot be easily broken, because a covering that is fully activated does not allow intrusion to remain. It stands firm, unshaken, and complete, denying access to everything that does not belong and preserving everything that does. Victory is often misunderstood. It is commonly placed in the future, seen as something to be achieved after effort, after struggle, after endurance. It is treated like a destination that must be reached, a reward that must be earned, or a breakthrough that comes only after a long process of resistance. And because of this perspective, many continue striving for something that has already been secured. This is where the shift must happen. Beget. Or true victory is not ahead. It is already established. The blood of Jesus did not create a possibility of victory. It finalized it. It did not begin a process that depends on human completion. It completed what was required so that victory could stand independent of circumstances. It was not an invitation to try. It was a declaration that it is finished. This changes everything, because if victory is already secured, then the position is no longer one of striving, but of standing. No longer one of chasing, but of enforcing. No longer one of uncertainty, but of confidence rooted in what has already been done. Yet many still live as though victory is distant. They measure their position based on what they see. They define their progress based on how things feel. They determine their standing based on circumstances that appear to contradict what has already been established. And in doing so, they unknowingly step out of alignment with the truth that has already secured their position. This is not because victory is absent, but because it has not been fully recognized. Recognition is what activates experience. Because what is not recognized cannot be consistently enforced. And what is not enforced often appears as though it does not exist, even when it is fully present. Victory is not something that fluctuates. It does not increase or decrease based on conditions. It does not become stronger in good moments or weaker in difficult ones. It remains constant because it is not dependent on external factors. It is rooted in a finished work. This means challenges do not cancel victory. Resistance does not remove it. Pressure does not reduce it. None of these have the authority to change what has already been established. They can only attempt to distract from it. And distraction is one of the most effective ways to create the illusion of defeat. Because when attention is fixed on the problem, the solution feels distant. When focus is placed on resistance, victory feels delayed. When perception is shaped by circumstances, truth can appear less real, even when it is unchanged. This is why alignment is essential. Alignment shifts focus from what is seen to what has been established. It removes dependence on external validation and places confidence in internal certainty. It repositions identity from someone trying to win into someone who is already operating from victory. This shift is not emotional. It is foundational. It changes how situations are approached. It changes how pressure is handled. It changes how decisions are made, because everything begins to flow from a place of confidence, not uncertainty. Before April ends, this understanding must become clear. Victory is not waiting, it is present. It is not approaching, it is already here. It is not dependent, it is secured. The assignment is not to create it, but to enforce it. This means refusing to accept anything that contradicts it. Refusing to align with thoughts, words, or patterns that suggest defeat still has authority. Refusing to give attention to anything that attempts to redefine what has already been settled, because defeat has no legal standing. Because defeat has no legal standing. It only has perceived influence where victory is not fully enforced. And once victory is enforced consistently, that influence begins to collapse. Not always instantly, but inevitably. Because truth does not need time to become true. It only needs recognition to become active. Before April ends, there must be a decision to stop pursuing victory as though it is ahead and to start standing in it as though it is already established. When coming to speak from it, to think from it, to act from it, because once this alignment is consistent, something shifts internally. Confidence becomes stable, fear begins to fade, clarity, NC increases, and what once felt uncertain begins to feel settled. This is what happens when victory is no longer seen as a goal, but accepted as a position that cannot be easily shaken, a position that does not depend on circumstances, a position that remains regardless of what appears externally. And once this position is fully embraced, defeat loses its place completely, because where victory is understood and enforced, nothing else can remain. There comes a moment when understanding must turn into action, when knowing the truth is no longer enough and alignment becomes the only path forward. This is that moment. Not later, not eventually, but now, before April comes to an end. Because what is delayed in action often becomes prolonged in experience, and what is left unapplied remains unchanged. Everything that has been revealed carries a responsibility. Not a heavy burden, but a clear direction. A call to move from awareness into activation, to stop observing truth from a distance and begin living within it, because truth was never meant to remain theoretical. It was meant to be enforced, lived, and consistently applied. The blood has already spoken. Redemption has already been secured. Protection has already been established. Victory has already been finalized. Nothing new needs to be created. Nothing additional needs to be earned. The only step remaining is activation. And activation begins with decision. A clear, firm, and unwavering decision to align fully with what has already been done, to no longer entertain what contradicts it, to no longer give space to thoughts, patterns, or influences that attempt to reintroduce limitation, fear, or uncertainty. Because every moment of hesitation creates space, and space, if left unguarded, becomes access. This is why consistency is essential. Not occasional action, but daily alignment. Not temporary focus, but sustained attention. Because what is reinforced repeatedly becomes established deeply. And what is deeply established becomes unshakable. This is the assignment before April ends. To speak with intention, to declare with clarity, to stand with authority, not once but daily. Every morning becomes a moment to align with victory, to remind the mind of what has already been secured, to reject every lingering trace of doubt before it has a chance to grow. Every night becomes a moment to reinforce protection, to close every door that attempted to open throughout the day. to ensure that nothing on horizon remains active. This is not routine. It is reinforcement. Because what is reinforced remains strong. What is neglected begins to weaken in experience. There must also be a refusal. A refusal to go back to old patterns of thinking. A refusal to accept limitation as normal. A refusal to entertain defeat as an option. Because once truth has been revealed, returning to old alignment is no longer neutral. It is a step backward, and backward movement is not the direction for this moment. This is a forward alignment, a firm positioning, a consistent standing in what has already been given. There is no need to wait for confirmation, no need to look for external signs, no need to depend on circumstances to validate what is already true. Because truth does not become true when it is seen. It is already true before it is experienced. And experience follows alignment before April ends. This alignment must be intentional, not driven by emotion, but by decision. Not dependent on feeling, but rooted in understanding. Because feelings change, but truth remains. And what remains must be what is chosen. This is the final moment of clarity. What is accepted will be experienced. What is rejected will lose its influence. What is consistently declared will become reality. So the decision must be clear. To walk in redemption without looking back. To stand in protection without fear. To live in victory without hesitation. Because everything required has already been provided. Nothing is missing. Nothing is delayed. Nothing is uncertain. The only question that remains is this: will this truth be activated? Or will it remain unused? Because what is activated now will shape what continues beyond this moment. And what is consistently enforced will define what becomes permanent. Before April ends, the choice must be made firmly. No more passive awareness, no more delayed action, only consistent authority, only full alignment, only victory lived completely, confidently, and without compromise.